If you're enjoying the Heath Geeks Book Club podcast, we'd appreciate if you hit the subscribe button, leave a like, rating, or review, whichever your preferred podcatcher platform allows.
This edition of our podcast is brought to you by 360 Health and Well Balanced Nutrition.
Welcome to the Heath Geeks Book Club podcast. Listen in as Kristen Norton and Eleanor Russell review all those great health and wellness books you've been wanting to read or you have read and want to talk about. Here's Kristen and Eleanor.
Hey everybody, I'm back in the studio and another Health Geek conversation.
What studio are we in?
The Omniverus Studios at Liberty Plaza
in the
downtown Winston-Salem,
North Carolina. Another sunny day here.
Oh yeah, it's a beautiful day.
Yeah,
cold but beautiful.
Beautiful.
And how are we feeling, everybody? Are we feeling great?
My dopamine is high.
Oh, all right. Well, take us away then.
So dopamine, that is a word you may have heard more of. I know I have in the past several years.
We've talked about it.
Yeah, we've talked about it. And, you know, the phrase dopamine hit is something that I say and I've heard other people say. So I'm curious, y'all, what is yours? Is it sugar, shopping, vaping, social media, or the Washington Post? What's your thing? We all engage in behaviors we wish we didn't, or to an extent we regret. Well, the book we're talking about today offers practical solutions for how to manage compulsive overconsumption in a world where consumption has become the all-encompassing motive of our lives. And we'll talk about the consequences of that.
What's the book called?
The book is Dopamine Nation by Lembke. Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence.
Oh, man.
Tell us a little bit about the author and publisher, Eleanor.
I would like to. So Anna Lembke is a smart lady. Most of these authors that we're running to are very well credentialed from some prestigious places. This gal, in 1989, got a BA from Yale in the humanities.
Oh.
Yeah, and then in 1995, she got her MD from Stanford. So she became a medical doctor, which means she had that broad humanity underpinning, which I think is wonderful for medical providers. And then in 1998, she sort of specialized with a residency in psychiatry. So she's a psychiatrist. She's an actual practicing person. And so her book is really interesting. She's written another book, The Drug Dealer MD. Came out in
I didn't know that.
2016, which I think would be an interesting read, talking about the role that the medical profession has played in this addiction epidemic that we got going on in this country. We are quadrupling the opioid prescribing between 1999 and 2012, and it's gotten even more since then.
Oh, wow.
But we're paying attention to it. And a little bit more about the book, then I want to go back to that concept about this epidemic. She specializes in addiction medicine, and she was interviewed in a documentary that I watched. Did you see The Social Dilemma?
Oh, she was in that?
Yes.
I didn't realize
and
that.
I want to go back and find her because I wasn't aware that she was one of the voices in there.
Oh, cool.
But if you have not seen The Social Dilemma, I would recommend watching it. It's a very interesting presentation about social media and its impact on our health and well-being.
Definitely, I agree.
Yeah. I think she came originally from Illinois, from the middle of the United States, but she ended up on the West Coast. Her book is published by Dutton, a Penguin Random House, which is the largest English language publisher in the world. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's cool. And anyway, this is what they call a boutique imprint. So Dutton is a boutique imprint, a random house. Yeah. Anyway, interesting little story about how that came to be. But it's a well-constructed book, well-reviewed and all that kind of stuff. But when I said I wanted to get back to the over-prescribing, I can't remember what I wanted to say about it. Do you have an idea?
A good statistic or something to share?
Yeah, I had that one.
We got all our notes spewed out everywhere.
Yeah, that's kind of the way we do it. So today, 1 in 4 American adults is addicted to something, and 1 in 20 children are taking a daily psychiatric drug. Does that make you wonder? Because I'm out in public a lot. I'm running around with people who are on drugs. And she really calls to task, what are we doing? Are we really helping people?
Yeah, and I don't think really the book focus is about the drugs, and they can be helpful in ways. But what she does call attention to is just the way we've set up our world. And it was shocking to me to think of it in this light, that now in a world of abundance and our desire for immediate gratification, we now are vulnerable to this adaptation of our brains to need more to feel pleasure as we're avoiding pain.
Yeah.
And that's really what I saw as the problem that she set up here.
Yeah, yes, I would agree with you. The book offers us a practical solution, though, to manage compulsive overconsumption when we're in this world where consumption's become the encompassing motive of our lives. It's get more, get more, get more. The secret to finding the balance is combining the science of desire and the wisdom of liking and the wisdom of recovery. So when we're talking about evolution, we used to, the theory says we were not so numerous and we were living with nature, and nature is part of us, so we never really separate from nature. But we would hunt for things and we would find things, and there weren't a lot of them, so we'd have to go hunt for more. So it was scarcity, and that was the driving thing. Now, and that's millions, is it millions of years? It's millions of years. Okay. Mm-hmm. And now we have overabundance. You can find stuff everywhere. You don't have to hunt for it. You don't. So this we're living in an abundance.
Everything is readily available.
But biologically, we're wired for scarcity, and so we're having trouble managing ourselves in a state of abundance.
Yeah, that's well put.
Yeah. Well, thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Well, I listened to this book on Audible. I don't have the physical copy, so I could have missed this, and you can pass over this request. But can you tell us a little more about dopamine? Because I don't feel like she went in, even though the title's Dopamine Nation, she just went straight into addiction.
Yeah, if you had the book, you would have felt differently, because her discussion, and that was one of the things I would say about this book that I really like. Sometimes when people take a very sophisticated, complex biological system with parts of your brain that nobody's ever heard of, in the general public, like the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. She took all that, and she has illustrations, which if you're listening, you would not have access to.
Yeah, those would have been
And
great.
they're very nice cartoons, and they are just very helpful in a quick read to kind of get your bearing on, the reward pathway. Because dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical that's released from a presynaptic neuron, and it has a receptor on the postsynaptic neuron. And it triggers action potential, and that carries a message that causes something else to happen and communicates with other parts of you. And so when you do something that you like, this chemical gets secreted. So when you eat chocolate, there's an increased, like 55% increase in your dopamine. And then if you do things like amphetamines, if you have sex, here you go. Because Tim said he was interested in sex today, so not with me. I'm sorry, take all that back. Anyway, we have 100% increase in dopamine, and then if we take a cigarette, the after cigarette, that's 150% increase in your dopamine. And cocaine gives you a 225% increase, but the amphetamines, 1,000.
And so this increase in dopamine is like, hey, this is a good thing. We should keep doing it.
So what happens is that reward pathway is, oh, that was good. Let's do it again. Oh, that's good. Let's do it again. And then if you feed it and habituate it, then what happens to the balance? Because she very clearly says pleasure is connected to pain. And there's a lot of historical evidence for that, a lot of biological evidence. It's a teeter-totter. It's one of our what we call homeostatic mechanisms, where if you have a high pleasure, you're going to get a pain swing to bring you back into the neutral zone. And so that pain is something that we don't like. So to avoid the pain, you go for the pleasure. And so you keep doing more pleasure, and then if you can't maintain that, the pain you're going to feel is even more exaggerated. And that's why addiction becomes interesting. And so she says on page 2 of this book, persons with severe addictions are among those contemporary prophets that we ignore to our own demise, for they show us who we really are, because all of us have the potential to become addicted. And that's what you said in your opening. What is your addiction? Is it the internet? Is it TV? Is it, you had a list of things that...
Yeah.
So we all have the capacity for addiction. And another book we just read and reviewed called No Sweat, we talked about to-do lists could be addictive, because it makes you feel like you're in control. You feel like you can do it. And it's all of a sudden, it's not really working the way it's supposed to work.
Exactly.
And then you don't get your to-do list and you have pain. I mean, it's something simple. And her addiction, did you get her addiction?
I was going to share that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, the author, Anna, even says that she was addicted to teenage romance novels or romance
Just
novels?
junk novels.
And I thought that was interesting. I'm like, oh, well.
Yeah, we're even going to talk about that. I mean, is that really an addiction? But it was.
But for her, it was. Yeah, it was taking over other parts of her life, and that's
she
what
wasn't
she says.
sleeping. She wasn't doing some of the good health behaviors because this thing became really important.
It was compulsive and destructive. So, yeah, a lot of things can become that way. And as I said, I was listening, and...
Did she read it? Was she the narrator?
I think so.
That would be interesting because I saw her on YouTube and I thought, oh, I could listen to her. I liked her. And I loved this book, you guys. Everybody, this is a must-read in my opinion.
Well, I'm circling around to something funny you said about Tim and sex. Well,
okay, good.
The comment was, I couldn't listen to this around my kids because what I did not expect is...
The first chapter?
The first chapter was all about stories. Well, and it kind of was woven throughout the book, but a story about someone who was addicted to sex.
It was called Masturbation Medicine. It's like,
That was the title name.
That's the first chapter?
Yeah. And Tim was like, "Oh, I'm intrigued." So if you're intrigued
thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so you could get some ideas from this, Tim. But
I learned more than I wanted to know about what people do when they're addicted to that.
Yeah, and
masturbation.
actually, one of the things that comes out in this internet addiction is that one of the troubling things about it, and I've heard this talked about in the social media, Social Dilemma as well. And I heard another psychiatrist maybe 20 years ago saying her concern about the internet was that people with abnormal psychological deviancies usually are isolated. They're not around a lot of people that think like they do. While in the internet communities, they can find each other, and then they can build a very strong community. And what happens in that is that their behaviors become normalized because other people are doing them, so it must be okay.
Right, and reinforces
and it perpetuates things that most of us would never have thought of. And that's what happened to me in that first story with her patient. I would never have thought of the stuff this guy did. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to think about that for a little bit.
Right.
But so, yeah, she has a list of people, and I like authors that do this. The storytelling and the humanization. She's got Muhammad and Jacob and Michael and Delilah, Kevin and David. You meet these people, and you hear what they're struggling with, whether it's a pot addiction or a cocaine attention whore, as one of them calls himself, or this kid that just does whatever he wants because there's no consequences for anything, and he's addicted to doing just anything, Yeah. I mean, it's no self-regulation whatsoever. Or on the drugs, I didn't even know about this one, buprenorphine. Do you know about that one?
Mm-mm.
Yeah. Prozac, I do. Food was another addiction that she goes into. Truth. So these people were fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the best health books are like this. They're chock full of stories and real-life examples in addition to the science and the research information. It just makes it
real.
Yeah,
and she says there are prophets because by them telling us their story, we can see maybe why it is, and then how to help them, but also how to help ourselves not fall into that. So she has we like these authors that give us these words that each letter means something.
Right.
So she's got dopamine is her word. And she's found a way to use that with her patients. So in each one of these stories, she kind of goes through the dopamine, an acronym, and lets us understand more about that. But before we get into the detail of that, I do have one. Tim, you said you like words. I have another friend that likes sentence structure, and I kind of like all that stuff too. And this author started so many sentences with the word "but." Which you just can't do. You can't do that.
That's not proper grammar anyway.
No, that follows a comma.
That's funny.
But the other thing that one of my friends and I talk about is when anybody goes on and then says "but," it discounts everything preceding the "but." So "and" is a better conjunction if you're trying to make a point. We have this situation, and then So every time I see that "but" word, I say, well, okay, do I discard all that stuff you just said? So I had a little struggle with that.
That's a good point.
I'm going to go off on a tangent
Okay,
here,
good.
but it's like when people say you're not going to believe this, well, why are you going to waste my time and tell me? If I'm not going to believe it, why are you going to tell me? Are you just going to lie to me? I just that bothers me to no end. You won't believe what happened next. Well, then I'm turning the channel. I mean, there's no reason for me to sit here if I'm not going to believe it.
All right, I'm making notes for my future book to not use the word "but."
Yeah, you can use it in the middle of a sentence if you need to, and if you really want to throw away the old idea and replace it with a new one. But
Well, it can be powerful if you use correctly.
I do it all the time. I know I do. I'm guilty of this.
Use however.
You guys are cracking me up because you are also using the word "but" as you're talking about it.
Yeah.
That's why I said that. Yeah, it's like happens. It just happens.
It is.
It's nature.
So what's the risk for addiction? I mean, if we're going to talk about these people, what would be the risk for that? And one is access. If you have access to whatever this thing is that you're going to get addicted to, or if you have a mental illness and it's not really clear whether or not that predisposes you or if by getting the addictive thing you become ill. So it's not real clear, but there's a relationship there. And then trauma, social upheaval, and poverty. And she talks several times about the limbic capitalism, which was kind of a new idea to me, where we are living in this overabundance that causes our limbic system, which is the reward pathway, to be overactive. And it's motivating everything we do, from the economy, this idea of, the advertising of people telling you what you need. You don't need that stuff.
Right.
But you want it now. And so that idea of the liking, and you tried it, and that looks good, and then you get it, and it really is good, and you need more, and you need more.
And didn't she say that it kind of diminishes your prefrontal cortex a bit, which is your reasoning center and ability to hold off gratification?
Yeah.
So she just kind of calls out that this access and all of the abundance we have is setting ourselves up for that.
Yeah, but it's also dividing our society because the undereducated, the underemployed have time on their hands. And with the time, it's what are we going to do? And so some people will self-medicate or have time to explore these things and then get into that limbic economy where you just need more of whatever it is you're doing, and you then are dysfunctional.
Like there was one story she told of a guy who was in Stanford and then was having a hard time in Stanford, the college, and would go back home, and it wasn't until he went back home to Arkansas that he was exposed to drugs. And I think there's just certain areas where there's not a lot going on that tends to be where there's more drug activity.
Well, the county with the harshest drug use in the world.
Is that our home state?
It is in West Virginia. It's Wyoming County.
And is Huntington the capital?
No, Pineville.
Okay, because I thought Huntington was the opioid capital of the world.
No, well, it may be the city, but the county
okay.
of use is Wyoming County, West Virginia.
And does it still hold that?
It does.
Yeah, and that's sad. That's
it
very
is,
sad,
because there's nothing else to do. Mm-hmm. There's nothing to do there. Be it people are still there. Move.
Well, or the
that's what the OTM. That's an opportunity to move.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a comment from our last book.
Yeah, but I don't know. That's an interesting. There's nothing to do, and that the depression, the mental illness may take you into that too. It's like get creative. Is my
Well, you
thing,
need something to escape.
Yeah.
And the addiction is, I have nothing else to do, so this will take me away for a little bit.
Well, and I think that undereducated, which is maybe in that area as well,
Definitely.
yeah, feeds into that, because if you don't have a curious mind, or you don't know how to do things because you've been undereducated, or you don't have the ability to be educated, it's a cycle, a terrible cycle.
Well, and that's one of the things the author says is, instead of escaping, come back and be present and engage with the world. And I don't know, that's more towards the end of the book, but she goes into that. Did you have any other things to share about what exposes us to being addicted to things?
No, but it does lead to 3 causes of death: is drug overdose, alcohol, liver disease, and suicide. And those are deaths of despair. So, avoiding addiction could be good. Those are not happy ways to exit.
Well, yeah, and in these stories, so often it was someone who was struggling with addiction and then considering taking their lives. So,
they say that we're the rich nation and we have the highest risk. We have easy access to drugs, and if you have no meaningful work, no safe housing, no access to health care, your risk goes up. White middle-aged Americans without college degrees are dying younger than their parents. These are not good. Americans no longer talk to each other. They entertain each other, and this one just slammed me so hard. They do not exchange ideas. They exchange images. That's what we're doing. And we're blasting each other with all these images all the time. And there's no depth to any of that. And we're all, what do you say?
and our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter.
Because of that, yeah. It's not good. So she has the pursuit of pleasure. She talks about that and kind of gives you some ideas and uses that sex addict as an example in that part of her book. But then she talks about self-binding, which was kind of a new term for me.
Yeah, that's a whole part or section in her book. Mm-hmm. Not new to the concept, but definitely new to that term she uses. So tell us about self-binding, or what she means by that.
There were some really interesting ideas in there. She says that I'm taking it as self-regulation and self-control. In that way,
like setting up barriers so that you can have more self-control.
And her strategies for that, there are 3 ways you can do that. It's by space, by time, or by meaning. You can put time limits on something, like I'm only going to watch TV from 7 to 9 tonight. I'm not watching it all day long. I'm not reading that book. I'm only reading 1 book a week or whatever. I'm not going to smoke pot before I go to work. I'm going to smoke it at lunch. There's stories in there about people talking themselves into, okay, I'm not going to do it at breakfast, but I can do it at lunch. And then it slides up to, I'm doing it at breakfast, lunch, dinner. And she also talks about the abundance of, it's not the abundance, but the concentration of the psychedelics in cannabis is much heavier than it used to be in the 60s when the parents of these current generation or smoking, the kids are smoking heavier stuff, which does daily use, she says, is leading to more addictions.
Well, there was this one gal that would wake up and smoke and then do it all day long, and her parents sent her to counseling. And
Delilah. Yeah. Delilah.
Of course, the names are changed, though. She was using every day, and that's kind of where the dopamine fast came in, where there's a word that stands for each letter of dopamine. But that she was having anxiety from the smoking, but she thought that the anxiety was coming from not smoking. And that was interesting. So they had her do a fast where she did not smoke. And that indeed, and there's a specific time period that abstinence is required for your brain to go back to balance. And she was like, "Oh, I don't have any anxiety anymore because I'm not smoking." And that was just a neat story
revelation.
that came to me when you said that.
Yeah, I liked her story because it was very well developed, and you liked Delilah,
Yeah.
and she succeeded in breaking her habit.
Yeah.
The marshmallow experiment, you all have heard about that. That came up in this self-binding as an example of, and I think it was done back in the 50s or 60s. They put a child in a room and gave him a marshmallow and said, if you don't eat this before I come back, you'll get 2 marshmallows. You've heard that marshmallow experiment. And so several of the kids couldn't do it.
Yeah, self-control was a problem.
Yeah, and that's a self-binding idea. But she also calls it delay discounting. The kids that couldn't do it were able to discount that extra one for the immediate reward. It's like, I don't need the extra. I just need this one. So people who have experienced scarcity and things like that are going to behave differently. But the other thing was they watched the children that could avoid it. They covered their eyes. They turned their head.
It like a pet.
And one of the kids actually made it a friend, which I thought was, and they thought it was an unusual strategy. But it worked. The kid didn't eat the marshmallow. Those children grew up to be more successful than the ones that couldn't wait.
Right.
Yeah, they had a much healthier, balanced life than the ones that were immediate gratifying themselves, and they were at risk for things. So these experiments, we've known about this stuff for a while, but she weaves it into a really good story. So any drug that presses on the pleasure side has the potential for addiction. So that marshmallow, you could get addicted to that because it tastes good. Kristen, let's talk about that dopamine, an acronym. So data, D stands for data. And with each one of these clients that she's talking to, she asks these open-ended questions that I think you as a counselor probably are very familiar with. Did you like the way she was just ask and tell me your story?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the way I practice as well.
I thought you did.
And this kind of goes into one of her chapters about honesty, but data is just where you have to be honest. You have to see the numbers. You have to know what you're doing. And, to an example she gave, sometimes just hearing when you're asked those open-ended questions, you can hear yourself out loud say something you may never get to when you're just thinking inside of your brain.
And we've talked about that in some of our other books about you calling your name and saying, Eleanor, did you know that you were actually smoking pot all day long? When you hear that, you go, oh, I wasn't paying attention,
Right.
And I'm not.
And as a dietitian, sometimes the data is, can you keep a food record and see what you are actually eating? And we'll go from there. And
so then the next thing they do is the objectives, dopamine, objectives would be, so how's that working for you? Or what are you trying to accomplish by that?
Right.
And get the person to say, well, I was depriving myself of food for 48 hours because I thought I'd lose weight.
Right. How's that working?
There you go. And it leads that conversation into a better, a more discovery process.
Right. And leads into P in dopamine is what are the problems related to this use?
Yeah. Like I'm fatigued and I can't get off the sofa.
Right.
Yeah. And so then the suggestion of A is abstinence, which you talked about with Delilah. The take a fast from this thing and see what happens. See how your body responds. And you can go back to it. It's not like you have to quit forever. It's just let's see what happens if you stop this behavior.
Mm-hmm. I think this is interesting when I think about food. Because, Eleanor, you've talked about twice a year? Just kind of rein things in for 7 days.
Yeah, I do a plant-based, what I call a cleanse.
Uh-huh.
And it's a focus not only on what I'm putting in my body, but also some meditation and just a break. And I do it with the equinox, so I'm in the natural rhythms.
So it just made me think of how sometimes with food you can reset things, maybe your taste buds, the way that your brain and your dopamine are reacting to certain foods that, sometimes that abstinence from that can help. And in this case, there's so much more about drugs and hardcore addictions than I thought would be in this book. But that was, it was from all addictions, but a lot about the drugs and the opiates. Okay, so M.
Mindfulness, which, we've been hearing a lot about recently. And I really enjoyed that conversation about watching your thoughts instead of reacting to them or doing something with them. You just acknowledge them. And it's hard for a lot of us to do that.
And I think this goes to the core of what we were saying, that a lot of times addiction is an escape from reality, escape from wanting to feel. And this is where she says, okay, you got to be mindful and think and just sit with the uncomfortableness of life sometimes.
It's just nice discussion about that. The next letter is I for insight, which that mindfulness can give you insight into, there it is.
Yeah. And then next steps.
Yeah, and it's, what are we going to do about that? And designing the next steps. And then I loved the E, which was experiment.
Yeah, what did you love about the word experiment?
Because, well, I'm a scientist, but on the other hand, it's that permission phase, I think, that we are hearing more about, is being more compassionate with yourself. If you have an addiction to something, it's wired into you. It's not going to go away immediately. And so you experiment with things, and if they don't work, you don't quit or give up. You try something else. Or, extend the time or shorten the time, or, try something different. I thought she was very creative with that experiment step.
And you hear through the stories in this book of everybody's different experiments until they got to what actually worked.
Right. And remember, Lembke, was it Anna? No, this is Anna Lembke. Michelle Segar, in her books, talks about, pause and take an opportunity and play. That idea of creativity. Like, if you can't do what you thought you want to do, have some ideas about other things you can do. And I think that's an experimental step as well.
Right, and it ties back to what you liked, how she said learning goals over
performance goals. Exactly. When you tie yourself to performance, you can get disappointed.
Yeah.
Like, I can't do it. And that can't word is awful. It's like, and then why try? And so I quit.
So an experiment is something you can learn from. You can take the results and then apply them through other techniques or, yeah. So that's what dopamine stands for, and that's your dopamine fast, to get back to that balanced state of say that word.
Equilibrium.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Between
we call it neutral.
Between pain and pleasure.
Right. Because she says you get a broken balance. It's not in balance anymore. And that pain and pleasure have to be in balance. Because if it swings too hard, you're going to get a recovery swing in either direction. So, which takes us to an interesting point about the pursuit of pain.
Yeah.
Which I thought, well, this is tricky. Are we getting into sadomasochism here or what? I mean, we started off with this masturbation, so what are we doing now? But anyway, so the...
They're not mutually exclusive, right?
Let's go back to the book. She gave an example of this... Okay, well, there are three parts to this chapter where she talks about, or this section of the book, pursuit of pain. She says you press on the pain side, or you can practice radical honesty, and you need prosocial shame is an interesting dynamic there, too. So all three of those were kind of new angles at this for me. I had not read this before. But anyway, in the pursuit of pain, they give a dog experiment, which, we don't do these things anymore, but she said they did get some valuable information. They took this poor dog and put electrodes on its paws and listened to him whelp and scream. Awful stuff. But it brought up the idea of hormesis, because what they found out after the dog kind of got habituated to this pain thing or experienced it, he would have a fit of joy. He'd come off the table and go lick the person's face and just be as happy as he could be. And so they were going, that's odd. Here we've caused you this discomfort, and now you're doing this, I love life. So pushing on the pain brought that same reward thing of pleasure.
Exactly. Yeah.
An overabundance of pleasure response.
She says it's a natural, reflexive, physiological response to pain.
Yeah.
And that a little pain and challenge are good, too much are bad. So 2 other examples I wrote down were worms that were given 2 hours of heat exposure, and they lived longer than other worms. But the ones that were exposed to 4 hours had reduced lifespan. And then centrifuged flies.
Yes.
So they're spun around in this little machine for 2 weeks, outlived other flies, and were more agile in their older age.
Yeah. So that trauma is actually not hurting them.
Well, but too much is,
Exactly.
because the flies that were spun longer did not thrive. So it's interesting that just like a little bit of challenge is that sweet spot that can help us grow.
I didn't know that flies lived that long.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
right? It's weird.
Old age, right? So, do you remember the book we read, The Switch? I think it was John Rady.
Yeah.
And he talked about hormesis.
Did
And
he?
that's
Okay.
exactly what this is. Yeah, because you talk about the rapamycin. And,
That's where that ties in.
Yeah,
Okay.
but that idea of radiation, and she calls this work in her book too, about people exposed to radiation sometimes do better than people that are not exposed to radiation. She uses the Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Japanese huge study. People in the center of that blow up, they didn't do well. They vaporized. But the ones out on the...
They didn't make it to the study.
Oh, and prayers for them, because that's awful. But the ones at the extreme edges who had some exposure actually ended up having longer, better lives than people who didn't have the exposure. And then we've read about dock workers that are transporting radioactive materials also having some health benefits, which is kind of counter to what I think the general public would think about. You see those triangles around, you say, oh, I'm going to avoid that. Maybe a little exposure is okay. And so with exercise, you were talking about a little bit hurts. There's an over-exercising syndrome. People can over-train and really hurt themselves. So there's that sweet spot in that behavior. It doesn't have to be a drug addiction. And with the reading, there's a sweet spot in what's the appropriate amount of reading. But this woman that wrote the book was off the edge, she says.
Yeah, it was fascinating in the second part that she calls, if we consume too much pain or in too potent a form, we run the risk of compulsive and destructive overconsumption of it.
Exactly.
And so that can be in the form of exercise. It could be, I don't know if this is necessarily considered an addiction, but it was intriguing, the man's story about how he went from, I think, alcoholism to like cold exposure extremes.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that because we've heard about shock therapy, cold shock therapy being good for us. Take a cold shower.
Right, and I think and there's lots of benefits, but he was taking it far, and I don't know that that's a bad thing, but...
Oh, yeah, evidently it stimulates dopamine. You get a dopamine response from that shock. But the other books that we read about this didn't go down that path. They went down the path of thermogenesis, that the cold shock would stimulate the brown fat and would cause a higher caloric consumption, which could be healthy for metabolism. So it's interesting which scientists look at which dynamic
good
in these
memory on that.
situations. And I thought that was fun to think about, too, because she was looking at the neurotransmitters, not the metabolic transmitters.
Yeah, I took notes on this. One study, although it was only 10 people, they were doing a cold plunge for an hour, and it increased dopamine by 250% and norepinephrine by 530%. And then the levels stayed elevated for 1 to 2 hours. So this man found that, like, after a cold shower, and then he kept trying more and more cold exposures, that it was like a great cup of coffee, and I was feeling alive. And this explains why, because that cold exposure increases and makes it stay up longer.
Yeah, it's good to know.
So kind of a
Take
good
a cold
natural
shower.
high.
Yeah, exactly. In a way, yeah. Well, if you have this prolonged consumption of dopamine, though, because you're kicking out a lot, if you keep consuming it, it can actually make things worse because it leads to a dopamine deficit state. And that's the tilt of the...
Teeter-totter.
Yeah, and so she has a really good cartoon in the book about destructive things where you have overconsumption, and and she uses that model to show different behaviors all the way through it. But in this same section, she talks about honesty, and she talks about this pro-social shame. She had a great story about a guy with a DUI who really didn't have that much of a problem with alcoholism, but he had been drunk and he had waited to get in a car, but got up in the middle of the night and went home, and he still had a high level in his blood, got stopped, blew the 2 points over or whatever. And so every time he went to apply for medical school or law, I can't remember which one it was, this DUI question shows up, and he always says yes. And so finally the attorneys and things said, look, you're going to go in the courtroom, they're going to ask you, you say no, lie, basically. And so he was sitting there, and he couldn't do it. He told the truth. He said, no, I had a DUI, And the judge stopped and said, are you sure you want to say that? Because, if you do say that, your career's busted. You're not going to do this. He said, yeah. And so it cost him. And, reading it, you're thinking, the guy's stupid. Why didn't he just, it wasn't that big a deal. But she brings up the AA story through here. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, he was then told he had to go to AA. And anyway, in the story of that, there's a readjustment of the sobriety date and this kind of thing. And the author even thought it was extreme for AA to cause him to have to go back to the beginning. And the outcome of the whole process was actually that probably saved him from saying, a little bit's okay. I got away with it. I can do it again. I'll get away with it again. And so do you remember that story at all? Did it strike you as a kind of a, it's like, what's the big deal here?
Yeah,
but the honesty
she has
is
a good
true.
point.
Oh, she does.
That honesty brings us back to humanity and brings us closer together when we can admit that we're all imperfect and accept one another despite our flaws.
Exactly. I mean, there's a great message in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that the lying causes you to be isolated. And that's what you're saying. It brings us together when people can trust you and say, you're going to tell me the truth, and I know you're telling me the truth. Speaking our truth can change the brain. That's a big one.
Yeah, I wrote that it's a brain-boosting practice, the awareness and practicing honesty. And I think that just kind of put more emphasis on that in my practice and personal life. That, yeah, even if the behavior isn't changed right away, just the benefit of being honest and open about it is huge.
Mm-hmm. And she discriminates between shame and guilt, and I liked that. The shame is a maladaptive emotion, and it focuses on us being bad, ourselves. I'm a bad person. Whereas if it's guilt, it's an adaptive emotion where you say, I'm not bad, it's what I did was bad. I have the ability to reform, because I am a good. And I think when people can own that, it can be powerful. Anyway, she's a big advocate for the AA accountability with compassion program and how successful it is. There's another thing that she came up with in here that I had not run into before. Have you ever heard of club goods?
No.
Yeah. And she took on congregations, religious groups, where some of them, as an example, and it can be applied in lots of situations, but she was talking about some religious groups, say you have to wear certain clothes, you have to eat certain foods, you can't do certain behaviors. And what that does is it gets rid of what we call the free riders, people who are going to come along and get the benefits of that religious community without really being a part of it. And when you look at a lot of congregations, there are a lot of people who do a lot of work in some of these congregations, and a lot of people just show up and have dinner, or have prayer time, and it's all good for them, but they don't have a what in the game? A card? What's in the game? A stick
Don't
in the
have
game?
a player in the game.
A player in the game, yeah. A dog in the fight.
Dog in a fight.
Dog in a fight. But so there's, and that's what AA she was talking about, is they're very strict, and if you don't do this stuff, you're not there. You got to do it. You got to do the program. And so the market forces on us influence our behaviors too. So it's not only these groups that have benefits, and then those of us that want the benefits without the work. And that club goods is the thing. And she talks about businesses and all sorts of things that use that concept. It was kind of new to me. And parenting, she took on the parenting thing too. And she says she worries that we have over-sanitized and over-pathologized childhood, raising our children in the equivalent of a padded cell with no way to injure themselves, but also no means to ready themselves for the world. By giving in to their every desire, have we encouraged a new age of hedonism?
Yeah, they need to be like those flies. Spin them around a little bit and they'll live longer.
It might not hurt them, huh?
Yeah, I think my major takeaways from this book, even though a lot of it was about drug addiction and other
it is. It's
more
an addiction
intense
story.
ones, just like for us with the more moderate, I guess, addictions and things that get us, that it just made me ponder where and when am I succumbing to instant gratification and the comfortable thing to do rather than that delayed gratification. And she says pursuing a little bit of pain instead of pleasure can go a long way. It's against our innate instinct to avoid pain, and it can add to our cognitive load, but there is a benefit of a little bit of pain. It goes a long way. So that's kind of my major takeaway is, am I going through life or am I teaching my kids to go through life with too much comfort? Because in the world of abundance, we can be rather comfortable with everything at our fingertips, you know?
Yeah. She's a practicing psychiatrist, and this is a story of her experiences. And I love that thing about learning from the patients she's had as the prophets of the rest of us. I thought that was good. There's a lawsuit out there right now. Did you read about the Purdue lawsuit? It's moving up to the Supreme Court. It's the biggest bankruptcy case in 40 years.
That's the drug company?
Yes, it is. And they're the ones that developed the Oxycontin, hydrocodone, and then encouraged doctors to overprescribe it. And so the company is going to have a bankruptcy plan. But the question is the family that owns the company also liable? And that's the decision that the Supreme Court's going to be facing is, can these injured parties now go after the billions of money this individual family has?
Oh, that'll be interesting to see unfold.
Yeah, but that was kind of a current thing that struck me as I was reading the book. And I thought, they're talking about this responsibility. Where's the responsibility for this epidemic that we got going on and this polypharmacy? Because people are having habits and then they're being prescribed something to help them with this drug habit that causes another interaction that causes the situation to be even worse. And she's wondering, she says that what if the drugs don't actually work the way they're supposed to? What if taking the psychotropic drugs is causing us to lose some essential aspect of our humanity? She really is struggling as a MD on how do we take care of ourselves and how does she, as a professional, do that. So I think she's going to have more to say, and she'll be somebody to listen to. Mm-hmm. I was happy to have been introduced to her. And thank you for reading this with me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Good suggestion.
And all of us know, this touches all of us. There's one other thing about the overprescribing for the ADHD. She says, go get your vitamin A. Adderall, Ativan, and Ambien are the three big prescribed drugs that she's saying we need to pay attention to. And the lack of self-care is an issue as well in here, is how do we take care of ourselves?
Right. It reminds me of the wellness gospel where they say, we're trying to put a Band-Aid on things instead of just get to the bottom of it. And I think our culture is set up to ignore self-care, and then we get into these problems. Yeah,
and there's money back to Tim. When you look at the food industry and the marketing with, you need food, so much food you don't need. And you're looking at the drug companies, here's a drug for that fix. You don't have to work. You don't have to think about it. Just take the drug. And maybe you do need the drug. I don't think, we don't throw the baby out with bathwater. But we've got stuff out of kilter.
You know what another headline is about drugs right now is that there's weight loss medications such as Wegovy, and there's a new one out called Zepbound. They were initially for diabetes.
I was going to say
now,
metformin does it too, doesn't it?
but I saw a headline in the news, a little story that they're finding this may be helpful for alcoholism.
Oh, wow.
So I'm watching this all unfold too, because it could be a useful thing, and at the same time, if we don't have the lifestyle change and the culture change, it's just a Band-Aid in the end. The story in here about the son who had a surgery or some kind of procedure in his brain to help with addiction, and then for 6 months he did the drug anyway just because it was a habit and because he could. Mm-hmm. I was just in shock when I was listening to that. But then I'm like, well, that is an example of if you get bariatric surgery or if you take one of these weight loss medications, but you don't address the underlying problems, then you're not anywhere ahead of the game.
Exactly. Yeah, a really good discussion about bariatric surgeries in here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I appreciated that.
My mother had that, and she now, this is 5 years later, still can't eat more than that much food in a sitting. And she can't eat after 7 because it just doesn't sit with her well.
Yeah, it's just, yeah. Well, maybe she got some benefits.
Oh, yeah, she's lost 100 and some pounds.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm Eleanor at 360 Health. I'm making healthy happen. And you can find me at 360health, number 4letteru.com. And I can help you think about daily practices and product consumption that might be healthier than some of these addictive substances. So reach out. We can start with a meology assessment and start a conversation.
Awesome. And I am Kristen Norton, one of the registered dietitians at Well Balanced Nutrition, where we offer nutrition coaching, help you overcome the barriers to changing your relationship with food and the way it affects your life. Visit us at wellbalancednutrition.com to find out more and book a free clarity call.
And stay safe, everybody.
Have a good one.
The views and opinions stated in this podcast are solely those of the contributors and are not necessarily those of our distributors or hosting company. This podcast is copyrighted, and no part can be reproduced without the express written consent of Kristen and Eleanor.